happy to introduce Professor Anjan Chakrabarti. I think today's presentation is very unique and a very important paper to understand the Mr. Niyogi's labor movement and his social life in India. So before we invite Professor Anjan Chakrabarti, may I introduce him very briefly? He is graduated from the University of Calcutta, and got his PhD from University of California, Riverside, and he had published many books. Especially, I would like to introduce one book, The Transition and Development in India, written in 2003 with Kullenberg. I think it is very important book to understand the economy of India, and especially on chapter 8, he have a very intelligent approach to the Indian economy. So I was totally moved on that topics. And he has so many other papers and articles, but we have no time to introduce all articles. So especially he writes a very important the paper. Especially one paper I would like to introduce is it is written on the 2009, the global order and the new economic policy in India, is from the Cambridge Journal of Economics. It's also very interesting for us to understand the Indian economy. And another is from the EPW, the labor, class, and economy, rethinking the trade union struggle, is also very interesting and intuitive papers, I think so. So then we will start his Professor Anjan Chakrabarti's paper. Today's the topic is revisiting the praxis of Shankar Guha Niyogi's Marxism. So shall we start the presentation?
So let me first share the and see if everybody can. Is it visible?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So I'd like to thank Professor Jongsoo Park and also my old friend Seung Jung for inviting me for this talk. Let me begin by saying that, in my opinion, in the Indian context, Shankar Guha Niyogi remains an unrepresented figure. And it is mind-boggling, in my opinion, how it has happened, you know. And so the problem with this is the innovation and he was an innovator in the field of politics that he introduced, remained absent in the world, in Marxism, in the global context as well, because I believe that he had introduced, he was ahead by decades on certain aspects that he was introducing through his practice, that it is only now that I see that is being talked about in the global context as well. And it has to do with, of course, one of the themes of the paper is finding alternatives and reconstruction, you know. So I thought that his ideas, and I'm speaking for the first time on Shankar Guha Niyogi, and I'm still learning and trying to understand, fathom the full context of his intervention. Looking back 50 years ago, actually, some of the things that he did, it's absolutely, in my opinion, astonishing that that such a figure is unknown in world Marxism. So I thought that this would be a good opportunity, actually, since I have this opportunity to present him to a global audience as well, so that they understand also that such a figure who focused on construction, I'll talk about it, that he posited what can be called the fourth stream of fourth path of Marxism in the Indian context. And I'll talk about this in a minute. In my opinion, it is not just a fourth path, it is perhaps a path we cannot but think about seriously today. And there's a lot of discussion today in the present context. So let me begin by saying, first of all, that his own life is nothing but to begin with his life. And it is very important because his lifetime and his political life, they were so enmeshed that it is impossible to discuss his political thought without referring to it somewhat. So and also, since many in the audience may not know about him, so it will be only proper that I introduce him a little bit. It will take a little bit of time that I may not give to Indian audience per se, but it is very important that I think the global audience also has see the context in which he was writing his, or he was indulging in his praxis, what we call the praxis, in a true sense. That is true. So it's impossible to discuss. Such is the complexity of Shankar Guha Niyogi's many-sidedness, that it is impossible to discuss all of it in a single presentation. So I will focus more on his relevance in the field of Marxism, which is what I thought the audience and the context of the seminar series also that would perhaps be interesting. I will desist from some of the what I think are the lacunas of criticisms here, because not really the criticisms or lacunas, but really these are more food for thoughts. We have to reflect on some of the things, and it is shameful, in my opinion, that it's been 30 years. We should have spent some time actually on his work and reflecting on many of the paths that he opened up through direct political practice and the problems in Marxian practice. So let me, without further ado, begin with, let me see, why is it not, let me begin with the political life of Shankar Guha Niyogi, very briefly. Actually, it's almost like a it would beat any thriller in the world, actually, in terms of what he did in his lifetime. He was born in 1943, and he died in 1991 at the age of 48 when he was assassinated. And his assassination still remains undetermined in the court of law. So he gave a last will where he basically said who are going to assassinate him. He was reconciled that he would die, but really nothing happened. That's a different line of discussion. discussion. So we here focus on his life, and he was born in undivided Bengal at that time, and he then moved to Assam, then studied in West Bengal before. And I won't spend much time on him because on this political life, because there are other things to discuss. Number one. Number two is the detailing itself. It's very interesting that he moved and his uncle recommended him to the engineering college in Bengal, in an engineering college in Bengal, and he couldn't take the recommendation, so he ran away from home, went to a neighboring state, which is called, which now is called Chhattisgarh. At that time, it was part of Madhya Pradesh, MP. So this is the map. So Bengal would be somewhere here. So he ran away and he moved to, this place and he joined the Bhilai steel plant. From now on, I'll call it BSP, to work in the coke oven department. And he joined the BSc program from a neighboring college. So, but from his childhood, he was influenced by Marxism and revolutionary politics. He joined the student politics of Undivided Communist Party of India. And so, and he was greatly influenced by the food movement of 1959. What happened in the streets of Kolkata when 80 people were, killed in police lathi charge. That left a lasting imprint in his mind. He thereafter joined the communist politics, and so he soon became involved there in Chhattisgarh, in Bhilai and Durg, in student politics, and later on trade union politics. And because of his militant position, he lost his job in Bhilai steel plant, which was one of the largest public sector enterprise in India. This Bhilai steel plant was supposedly one of the beginning point of India's industrial revolution from the 1950s onwards. It was built with Russian help. And so it was kind of the center for industrialization in that region as well. So it was very important to understand the importance of Bhilai steel plant. So it was part of this strategy by Indian government in the second five-year plan of 1950s of heavy capital goods production, which would drive the creation of heavy capital goods production, which would drive the industrialization project. And Bhilai steel plant was at the heart of this imagination of industrialization. And so he landed there, he worked there, he was fired from there. And thereafter, what is interesting is for 6 years then, he roamed around in various districts of Chhattisgarh, various regions of Chhattisgarh. Now, look at, this is a huge area and basically mostly forest, large part of forest areas, which is populated by indigenous population called Adivasis. Almost 35% of, I don't know exact figure now, at that time almost 35% of people were Adivasis or indigenous people. And the rest were mostly Chhattisgarhi or local people. So I'll talk about this in a minute because it will play a very important role. So he moved around this entire area for 6 years. For 6 years, he took various various positions. He was sometimes worked as agricultural laborer, sometimes as fisherman, sometimes forest worker, sometimes shepherd, hawker, and he came to know about, it was a big lesson for him, I think, given the kind of childhood education he had, or as he was growing up in revolutionary, that there would be revolution and so on and so forth. It was a big lesson for him actually, and we'll talk about this in a minute. To come in contact with the indigenous population, their way of life, their economic form, and he was really influenced by that, and it is important that he never considered them in the classical sense as we did certainly at that time, and still now, as remnants of pre-capitalism, as as this backward mass or anything like that. So he kind of forged a relation rather with the Adivasi. And he learned Hindi, which is the language in northern India per se, and he learned Chhattisgarhi, which was the language spoken by the local people of Chhattisgarh during that time. And he started thinking about this whole approach of Indian communist movement at that time, that it's not addressing the concrete reality of the exploited and oppressed people of Chhattisgarh, where he was working, and and that's where he wanted to begin his politics. Wanted to do his politics, because wherever you are, you start engaging in this political practice. I mean, that was his understanding of Marxism. And so he really started having second thoughts, not on Indian, not on Marxism, but on the conventional route of the Indian communist movements. And I'll talk about this in a minute. How he pioneered what is called the fourth route. Actually, tried to do. And this. This is where all his articles, and he wrote very little, but he wrote for his organizations. But whatever there is, little of it, all of it was brought together in this beautiful book. But it is in Bengali, and that's why I'm saying it's a shame, because I don't know why it has not been translated in English, because this was originally written in 1992. I think it will have important global lesson for world Marxism as well. So it needs to be translated. So and he was a poet as well. He became a poet. So you will find multi-sided, dimensions of Niyogi. So, and he, during this time, actually, he worked in the mines. Bhilai steel plant, the allied mines that were available where Bhilai steel plant was located. Basically, you needed iron ore and some other minerals. And there, the main workers were the Adivasi workers, and one of them was Asha, and he married the Adivasi mine worker. And you see his family life, he kind of symbolized this unison, this union of reflection. Perhaps it had an influence of the Adivasi at home, and the worker at home, I think, was instrumental also in certain way in him rethinking the whole issue. So he brought the concrete reality in that sense. It was brought to him right in his home as well. During this period, 1975-77, India had political emergency, and he was arrested. During that time, there was a revolt, and I'll talk about many of these aspects. And these are the main mining areas, Dalli and Rajahara. These are two mining towns, and the main iron ore and other minerals, would be processed through these mines. So the workers would be these were the main mines, a lot of mines, and they had, of course, the unions who were, and there was the contract workers were disgruntled against the union, and they invited Shankar Guha Niyogi or to help them, and during that time, after he was released since emergency, and they broke away from this existing unions to form the Chhattisgarh Mines Shramik Sangh, or Shramik is worker. So this is CMSS from now on. And the main issue for them was that regular or permanent workers were getting bonus, but they were not getting bonus. This was the immediate issue. The contractual workers, and they resisted, and there was police firing, and 11 people died. Shankar Guha Niyogi was also arrested, but the workers, continued with their agitation. For 2 months, all the allied ancillary industries of Bhilai steel plant was closed down. The mines were closed down, and then the Bhilai steel plant and the contractors relented, and Shankar Guha Niyogi was released, and he then became the undisputed leader in that particular entire region. And, he formed he became associated with this Chhattisgarh Mines Sangh, as opposed to, this was the trade union, as opposed to the official trade union. INTUC is the union of the Congress, and which is the one of which has ruled India for decades, and AITUC was the was the trade union for the trade union front of Undivided Communist Party, CPI. I'll talk about it soon enough. So and thereafter in 1979 he formed the Chhattisgarh Mukti Morcha, and I'll talk about this context as well in the formation of Chhattisgarh Mukti Morcha. So please bear with me on this ground, because it involves a further shift actually in Niyogi's intervention, moving from trade union in the conventional sense to a conception of trade union that would be very different. And so he was shot, in 1981 again, but he survived, remained a mass leader, and he led a simple life among workers. He was the founder of this concept, which now is known almost to every person who is involved in left politics or in social movements. It's called Sangharsh, Nirman and Sangharsh. It's very interesting. Sometimes Sangharsh and Nirman would be pointed out, but Niyogi, I found out at times at the end of his life, he was counterposing it as Nirman and Sangharsh. Nirman is construction, Sangharsh is resistance, both together. And finally, as I told you, he was assassinated in 1991. So we'll stop here. Then what happens to CMSS, its decline, etc., etc. We'll not go into that. We don't have the time for it. Maybe in discussion. This was his wife, Asha Niyogi. And they lived in a in a mud-walled worker house, and they had 3 children. Kanti, which is revolution; another children, Mukti, which is liberation; and Jeet, which is victory. So he named his 3 children, based on his political life and his individual his family life. They were very intertwined in that sense. All right. Now let me go to the to his some of the content that we need to discuss, which refers to this 4th path I was talking about. Now, you see, there have been attempts later on, which is continuing, and there may be good reasons for it, for those who do it. Niyogi has been called a Gandhian, has been called an environmentalist, has been called one of the pioneer of social movements in India. So there have been attempts to kind of displace the legacy of Niyogi into fields which are not avowedly Marxist in their orientation. But let me be clear, till the last letter of his life, he remained committed to Marxism. And in that sense, actually, though what he exactly meant by it, by the end of his life, needs to be further dissected actually at all. You can, what sense he was talking about historical materialism or dialectical materialism, because it was certainly not the way Indian Marxism or even conventional Marxism talks. He put it in his writings that he was committed to that. Anyway, uh, by he became, in fact, the point is, Niyogi, you know, he traversed all the three parties in the 1960s, from student movement to trade union to active politics and so on and so forth. Communist Party, Indian Communist movement got divided into three, uh, segments, three parts in the 1960s. There's a great division. So undivided Communist Party got divided into CPI, CPM in the early 60s, and then the Communist Party of India Marxist Leninists broke away from CPIM, Communist Party of India Marxist, under the influence of the Maoist, upsurge from the mid 60s onwards. And Nyogi's path also went in that direction, through that trajectory, all those influences. So in the late, he was influenced by that, all these different, or he passed through all these different traditions. He saw, as part of active politics, saw their problems as well, identified their problems as well. And regarding these three parts, from now on, Shankar Guha Niyogi, in short, is SGN. I'm referring to this term, or simply as Niyogi. Uh, Let me put it this way: that there is a huge, of course, discussion on how this division happened. I'm not going to discuss it. Those who are interested in it may look at. I'm sorry. Actually, I think this is only my responsibility. So this paper in Rethinking Marxism, so where you will come across, what are the different understanding of revolution, or the stage of Indian economy and mode of production and so on and so forth, mode of production debates that were happening in the 60s, so I've dealt with some of those issues, and these are well known actually, but one who wants to look at it in the context of Indian communist movement can take a look at it. But Shankar Guha Niyogi was aware of it. Now, I want to point this out, that he emphasized, his path. In my opinion, my understanding is that he was trying to chart out a completely different path, actually, uh, uh, without giving up on Marxism. This is my understanding, and he was called a revisionist, and at times, uh, environmentalist, and all those things. People were clubbing him, criticizing him, both from the left as well as from other non-Marxian strands, because I think as his experiments started happening in the 70s, I mean, there was no understanding actually in Indian Marxism of any possibility of this path. It simply did not exist. But Niyogi, of course, his point was that Indian concrete reality, there is no practice, there is no political practice in Marxism without taking into account the concrete reality. And therefore, uh, one needs to be aware. So he was talking about certain practical problems, as well as certain what he thought were understanding of Marxism. He was challenging it in some fundamental way. So really, in terms of what we may say, is there are four, taking the divisions apart, those three approaches, he kind of charted his fourth path, involved rejecting actually these 5 points that I have mentioned. And which is that, in short, this is my understanding, is that you see, Marxism, and till now actually, to perhaps the dominant strand even till now, is that unless you enact political transformation, there cannot be any social transformation or self-transformation and self-transformation. Therefore, the history of 20th century Marxism, in my opinion, has put considerable wager on state centrism. So you either try to get access to the state through parliamentary path, or you get access to the state through armed struggle. There is, in other words, the politics of Marxism or the political philosophy of Marxism got intertwined with state centrism. And the understanding seems to be that unless you have the control of the superstructural element of state, you can't start to begin a transformation of the class relations of production and other and cultural aspects and so on and so forth, let alone self-transformation. That seems, and this was the dominant Indian understanding in India as well in the 1960s, 70s. It remains true even today, in my opinion. Niyogi found this, problematic. Absolutely problematic. His argument was this need not be the only way, and it should not be the only way in terms of in terms of political practice in the field of Marxism. So his argument then was that all the three, political, social, and self-transformation, needs to be addressed. They must not be looked off as compartmentalized, but they are in an overdetermined relation. They are in a relation of mutual constitutivity, and that any kind of transition that you are talking about, or transformation that you are politics that you are transformation politics that you are talking about, must engage both with the transforming the concrete reality, hence construction, as well as resisting the old order, which will of course challenge this construction. So this was for him, as he so gradually he shifted from his focus on political transformation to what we have called, myself and my co-author Unudhar in their writing, politicized social transformation. That we are just not talking about intervention in the social plane for transformative acts, but politicized social transformation. And I'll talk about this as we go along. Number two, the third point is he was part and parcel of it, but he found this whole idea of vanguard party and vanguardism, as directing the workers' movement. He found it to be problematic. And he said, you can't have a social transformation and self-transformation, let alone even proper political transformation. That political transformation, which kinds of is based on a capture of state through or getting access to through state, through whatever means, in no way are going to last if the people do not access it. So the politics, Marxian politics, must engage in direct political construction. And the one who is going to lead this movement is working class construction. Be very careful. He was not one who was talking about spontaneity, in a crass sense that something will rise. No, his point was working class identity must be constructed, must be at the forefront, and that will take place in connecting all the three axes of political, social, and self-transformation. And hence, his was more a pathway perhaps he was suggesting, and he was trying to exercise, as opposed to vanguardism or some such kind of external interventions through direct democracy. So workers themselves will organize. So the, you know, the importance of consciousness being built. Consciousness is something you cannot reduce it to structural position, but it has to be built, and it can only be built through this process of, you know, what the workers can do, hence construction, and what they are going to give up, which is resistance. So this was very central, became over a period of time very central for him. The fourth issue is, of course, the ambiguity that the Communist parties, basically, from today's vantage point, we can say, they had an ambiguity towards the repressive and ideological apparatus. So if you are entering into the parliamentary path, then what the question is, you are getting into your hand the repressive apparatus as well as influenced by ideological apparatus. So what are you going to do? On the other hand, the Mao with the CPIML, or the armed, not the armed path, which was pioneered by the nationalism and so on and so forth, its entire focus was that the state must be defeated militarily, because it's basically an instrument. It's basically an instrument of repression, which is maintaining the mode of production, whatever the mode of production. So they kind of did not address the issue of ideological apparatuses, and the question of culture and all those things were not addressed. And Niyogi found this deeply problematic. So, and the argument is, when he was looking at Indian trade union politics, and he was part of this vanguard politics in Bhilai steel plant, he found all of these aspects to be problematically present actually in the Indian trade unions, including in the trade union of CPI, AITUC, and the CPAM. When it broke out, it formed its own trade union, C2. So that is why he felt the need to initiate a different, kind of trade union. So I have many things to say, but how many minutes do I have, Professor Park?
Yes, we have. We are planning to around the 40 minutes, but I think we have to continue some more times, okay, because we are around in half, isn't it? So you have some more times.
Yeah, if you can. So I'll have 15-20 minutes. Is it
yes,
okay?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Let me see how far I can. Because I think I have set up the context now, but it's very important to understand. So, in what way did Niyogi really, this fourth path? What is the content? How did he shift? Now, and what became of the idea of trade union? Now, given the dearth of time, he began, of course, with the Bhilai steel plant and the ancillaries industry, which were basically Bhilai steel plants outsourced its mining requirement for raw materials, which were iron ore and others, to the various labor contractors or mines, which were employing considerably contractual workers who would be hired, fired, etc., who had no permanence. And so he was the first actually in the Indian trade union movement who turned attention from organized sector worker to the unorganized sector worker, moving to contractual workers who were in large numbers, who were available in large numbers. And he did it. I mean, why he did it? For strategical reason or for other reasons, I think I'm not very sure of it, but perhaps it was the easiest way and the most fortunate way in which he could perhaps intervene, uh, and it's not to say that he intervened, but the situation rose, which made an intervention possible. He only led that's whatever movement was taking place at that time. And so but this is the key, the second point. For him, and as he analyzed the concrete situation, and remember the question of ethnicity is important because of this. He, through his journey through the field of Chhattisgarh in Bhilai and through the movements, he did a detailed analysis of the economic and social scenario of Chhattisgarh. And he came to this conclusion that exploitation or organization of exploitation that is transpiring around the Bhilai BSP and its mining sectors, it this aspect and the aspect of ethnicity are intertwined in the sense that the exploiters and their cohorts, okay, so by cohorts I mean those who are providing the immediate condition for the exploiters, the traders, the transport, the ones who are in charge of the transport, the state officials, the forest departments officials, and so on and so forth. That the it's just not the exploitative system we are talking about, but it's an oppressive system in the sense that there is this ethnic division which was being produced through the organization of exploitation. And the organization of exploitation in turn was being procreated through this ethnic division. So he came to the conclusion that the control over the income, wealth, land, as well as the instruments of power were in total control of the outsiders, or the who are non-Chhattisgarhi people who came from outside, and that the original Chhattisgarhi people, Adivasis, and other people as well. It's just not Adivasis, but other people as well. That they were, they were being subjugated. So the subjugation of working class and the subjugation of Chhattisgarhi people were intertwined. So we often in Marxism, this was innovative. I want to point this out. Today we are scratching our head over how do we account for these ethnic or non-class division and class division. It is, I think, it was extraordinary that Niyogi was able to formulate this conjuncture, and he did that. Actually, we are talking about around 50 years ago, 40, 50 years ago, and through the concrete practice. And that is what I am going to focus on, how he did it, And in that process, very interesting, we looked at the map of Chhattisgarh, CMSS and CMM, Chhattisgarh Mukti Morcha, which was the cultural front. So he moved to the cultural front, created another front actually, the Chhattisgarh Mukti Morcha, which was also in the front lines somewhat to the strategy of new statehood struggle, because he believed that if Chhattisgarh was created as a separate state, then the instruments of power of the regional state would come under the purview of the local people, and that would make a difference. Perhaps that was his understanding. Again, we need to go into the details of it, but he was among the one of the pioneers who was seeking a movement towards a smaller state from Madhya Pradesh called Chhattisgarh. Let me tell you that Chhattisgarh Niyogi was assassinated in 1991, and Chhattisgarh as a separate state was formed in 2000. So it is now a separate state in India, and the Shankar Guha Niyogi, in terms of his organization, was basically making the argument that it is to address the issue of organization of exploitation, address the issue of the state of the working class, that you need this conjuncture or this amalgamation to, or this linkage to happen between between the class and the ethnic question in the concrete context of Chhattisgarh. And he was very clear that this might happen differently in other contexts. So it is through these kinds of different movements that perhaps a different kind of fourth path may emerge, which is linked to the concrete scenario of the Indian uh, context that we are talking about. So so he began his one of the reasons perhaps he chose to begin with contractual mine workers was that almost overwhelmingly they were Adivasis, and that is Chhattisgarh original working people. So he started his organization and created the CMS as basically as a frontier of those kinds of contractual workers, and later on trying to move to departmental workers and more to permanent workers. But I don't have the time to go over it, but really CMSS was not very successful in doing so. Reasons for it is for another day. So what did this happen? What happened to then? How did it transform the idea of the trade union? Now here, this is unique in India, which happened was he transformed CMSS, and this was his basic point, that it is not just an organization which would be concerned with labor time, but CMSS is an organization which is concerned with lifetime of the worker, not just the labor time, lifetime of the worker. So he transformed the conception of trade union, and perhaps he was one of the first, I don't know, among the pioneers to do so, to situate this new conception of trade union. And it's not that he imagined it or anything like that. The workers themselves, led by Niyogi, created this, and I'm going to perhaps show you, and we'll have time given the situation to show you how this happened. So this was the concrete, as I told you, situation, as you can see in this PPT slide, concrete situation in terms of which the division and the relation between exploitation and ethnicity presented itself to Niyogi. And so what happened? Now let's follow from the beginning the arrows. As I told you, the movement began with bonus increase, wage increase, work condition in the mines. And as I indicated, it was successful, but at a great cost. 11 people were shot dead. So that was, but the CMS has then established its hegemony over the mines and the surrounding area. Now, what is interesting here is two things which happened. And I'm going to talk about cooperative mines and peasant cooperative later on. But two things which happened. The first is, as the workers' wage payment started to increase, they succumbed to the problem of, as Niyogi saw, of alcoholism. And, they were spending money, and he was open about it. He was talking about it, and he built a movement around it. That the work of what was happening was, this was detrimental to the working class mobilization, because it was blunting. Such was the problem, and the liquor was being sold by, again, non-Chhattisgarhi people, local capitalist business firms or some other firms, that this was really blunting the whole effort of working class mobilization, and this consciousness raising process that CMSS was emphasizing was getting blunted. Not only that, there was this additional problem of domestic abuse of women and children, which was happening through this rampant scenario of alcoholism. And there began a completely new approach in the history of Indian Marxism, as well as perhaps history of Indian trade union movement. Uh, Started CMSS and CMM now, both of them, and CMM's importance starts to become important here. Its presence starts to become important in terms of the social mobilization, cultural transformation. They started mobilizing the women and children of the workers. And the whole idea of Shankar Guha Niyogi was that the women, uh, they are also part. You have to consider the women and children part of the working class as well, the working class identity. There's no such working class identity, sitting out there. But this has to be created through the amalgamation of consciousness raising, mobilization, resistance. So resistance against this given scenario of alcoholism, and it's telling actually that you have to remember that at that time, the official Communist Party, which was trade union, which was AITUC, opposed this, and basically saying that the Adivasis are prone to drinking, alcohol. So they go together. So alcoholism and Adivasis, it's not the job of trade union to intervene. But so Niyogi was challenging this whole trap of economism into which trade union politics have fallen into. And since his objective was ultimate objective was to work to end exploitation, work to struggle against exploitation, he found out that there's no way this is going to happen unless the lifetime of the workers, unless you moved into the lifetime of the workers, the trade union, and started addressing the problems faced by members of the working class. So there began the alcohol struggle, struggle against alcohol, which was very famous at that time. Over 25,000 workers actually left alcohol as part of this movement, and many actually reduced consumption of alcohol. Hugely successful. And this then started through this, what still continues and still is well known. In fact, he was perhaps one of the first to start it at the local level, this particular CMSS understanding of a public health movement. Now, workers are lacking the basic, unless they have the strength and unless they are in a position to protect themselves, their family members and their children. So when you look at the mortality rate, I mean, it's scandal. They can't get access. There's no access to hospitals that they have, no access to, any kind of operations facilities that they have. So what happened was, and this was very important, the CMSS, and as part of the cooperative mines, since they had the profit under their control, they started diverting a portion of the profit for the creation of a new hospital. You have to understand this new hospital, which came up in the 1980s, was built entirely with the labor of the workers, entirely with the funds of the workers. So 30 to 40% of their wage was given. Everybody was giving it up for the creation of this hospital because that was seen as an indispensable radical need to address the social crisis that the working class were facing. And so, but as part of, for Shankar Guha Niyogi, as part of this, what was happening was workers were also finding out through the creative process, through this construction, their whole idea of raising the consciousness was being forged here. So a 40-bed hospital with an operating table, which is still running today, and many medical, it was not a single rupee, and not one labor was taken from outside. It was completely built by the workers. And there then became continuing till the school addressing public education, sports movement. It became really a kind of transformed the trade union and through the CMS, working as the CMS in the front also, into 24 into 7 and into a social movement. And as a struggle over the lifetime uh, and labor time, because it was the understanding that capitalist relations of production, this MCM dash prime that you have, the capitalist relation of production does not just run through the control of the labor time, but it runs also through the control of the lifetime. You have to address not just the repressive apparatus, resist and so on and so forth, but also the ideological apparatuses, and hence the question of building working class consciousness through the process of construction was central to engaging in transformation. And so in the context that I have situated now, how many minutes do I have? Let me see.
We can finish in 5 minutes, isn't it?
Oh, all right.
In 5 minutes.
Yeah. So another way to look at it, and this is something that I have tried to formulate in terms of my own understanding, is that the capitalist relations of production, say around Bhilai steel plant, BSP, or for that matter, any capitalist relations of production, it engages, of course, the continual original point is primitive accumulation. And we need not debate it here, but for me, primitive accumulation is a continual process, which is basically breaking down the other forms of life, creating dislocation, displacement of various kinds. In the context of Chhattisgarh, it was clear. So as Bhilai steel plant was created, the land of the Adivasis were taken, and over a period of time, through the passing of the forest laws and other things, the restrictions of to forests and so on and so. So Niyogi was of the opinion that what has happened is that the Adivasi original people who were connected to their particular system of local production have been expropriated from that position, or their living condition has been made so impossible that they have become wage labor, and they have come to work as contractual laborers in the mines and other places. So he connected clearly a continual process of primitive accumulation to that of capitalist relations of production. Both are happening in a simultaneous process. And in fact, this is a paper I've given to Professor Park as well, his paper on environment, and he engages on this relation, how both of them are going parallelly together. But this is just not happening. There is the other side also, which is also happening, which is that the needs of the workers, which were being taken care of in the old system, that is completely broken now. So there's a crisis of social life that they are facing, and so they become. It's just not a struggle inside the capitalist relations of production on wage, work condition, etc., etc. It's not just a struggle to resist the scenario of primitive accumulation, that is to ensure that Adivasis or indigenous people have access to forests and so on and so forth. But it's also a struggle to make sure that, and this has to be done by the workers themselves, that as far as possible, their needs are met. And so what happened was new kinds of formulation of needs, and I may call it radical needs, were coming up from the side of the workers, and as part of this movement, which was supposed to address the scenario of the crisis of individual and social life. So this whole model was encompassing the whole of this trajectory that we had seen. As you can see, these are some of the images going very quickly over it. Left hand side, you can see Shankar Guha Niyogi actually leading a procession, And then you have the Mine Workers Union, the Women Mine Workers Union. This is the anti-liquor campaign on the left. You can see the connection of the miners with the liquor, the picture of the liquor, And on the right-hand side, you could see the beginning of Shaheed Hospital, the hospital I was talking about. Shaheed means it was named after the martyrs. So the martyrs who died in 1977 as a result of police firing. The Shaheed Hospital actually became a symbol of what could be done by workers, and has been replicated in India, tried to be replicated in India in various ways, So, and these are some of the cultural front. Just one point I'd like to say, because we don't have much time on it, but I must say this. What was happening in 1972 or 1970? A new contract, workers contract labor act was passed in India, which made it costly for labor contractors to run some of these mines. And so these mines were taken over by the trade unions. Initially, AITUC and INTUC, the official unions, took it over. But soon the workers found out that it was basically the union leaders who were running the show, and they were not aware of any kind of profit sharing arrangement or any of these kinds of things. So when CMSS workers, when the workers revolted against these unions and formed their own unions, they took over these mines. And we are talking about thousands of mines. Similarly, in a place called, I forgot what it is, perhaps Banjari or something like that, the name of the place, Banjari, in a village called Banjari, which was displaced as a result of this expansion of Bhilai steel plant, So the Adivasis took control of a land, actually. The Adivasis or local people, they took control of the land, and they formed a cooperative. Now, note one thing, by that time, the workers became fully aware of the concept, but in practical politics, of the importance of surplus. So they were not only performing in some collectively determined, shared and manner. They were not only performing the surplus labor, but the surplus that was being generated by mines and these peasant cooperative were being appropriated by the workers, jointly, collectively appropriated by the workers and distributed according to their needs, distributed for their workers' wage benefit, as well as for addressing the radical needs I was talking about. So the Shaheed Hospital was built with, much of the funding of Shaheed hospitals came as a result of these cooperative mines, which were controlled by the CMSS actually. And they were in charge of, technology, how to, Bhilai steel plant was trying to attempt full mechanization. They resisted, so went for semi-mechanization. So they were in charge of the working condition, technology, the profit. And this was remarkable because it's not 1 or 2 years that they ran these mines, and this peasant cooperative ran it for a decade, more than a decade actually. And it was instrumental in building up the resources, through this control over the surplus that they had. It was also an experiment to see how it is possible. They made it visible that the workers can directly, and there was this, when I'm talking about direct democracy, that was what was experimented here. It was the workers who were running it completely. So they were deciding what to produce, how to produce, where to sell, and it was BSP. Of course, they were dependent on the Bhilai steel plant because they were kind of captive mines of Bhilai steel plant, but they had a lot of control over the decision-making process. And even the management of Bhilai steel plant had to engage in negotiation with these cooperatives, and the officials in these cooperatives were elected by the workers. They could be hired, fired by the workers, and so the workers ran these mines in what we may, from today's vantage point, we may call it directly communist class process, so appropriation, where the performance and appropriation of surplus was done collectively by the workers, and decisions on what to do with it, as well as many of the aspects of the labor time, and the technology, etc., was determined jointly by the workers. So, in this sense, by the, I don't have, I could have gone. In fact, I did not go into the whole idea of Sangharsh and Nirman, but you could imagine this construction and resistance now have got intertwined in Niyogi. The first, and I'll end with this, the first, in his last letter, before his assassination, and he was predicting that he would be killed, and he, by the way, he moved from a politics of violence to a politics of non-violence. He was convinced that there cannot be any construction through the politics of violence. Construction involves creation, construction involves bringing people together, and resistance is equally going to happen. Contradictions are going to rise as part of this working class mobilization. These contradictions that are going to rise are not just with respect to the state capital nexus, which is going to be there, but it is also going to rise from within the working class, okay, regarding, say, modes of surplus performance, regarding the ethical versus moral issue, regarding the structure, CMSs, or the cooperative versus the self. So all kinds of contradictions, conflict, resistance will happen. But, but the important point, in my opinion, what Niyogi was talking about was the importance of, through this, and it was, they were two-sided, they were together, the whole idea of this construction, that if the social is, in this sense, from today's vantage point, in a relation of word determination of all these elements, then it is very important that the engagement of the working class has to be in terms of address the issue of social political, social transformation, but not just in a apolitical manner, but to bring the politics of Marxism at the heart of this social transformation. And this will be the creative process. This will in turn create the working class identity, through direct construction. So I will stop. I think I had some more things to say, but this is enough.
Thank you very much, Anjan Chakrabarti. It was very impressive at the presentation, but generally we are unfamiliar about the exact concept of advocacy, or the Chhattisgarh background. So I would like to explain some the concept of the advocacy. Is in Korea, we call it the Bujongmin, is a kind of tribes. So, and as the Professor Chakrabarti has said, the Chhattisgarh has started from the 2000, isn't it? Yes. By the Madhya Pradesh Reorganization Act. Before that, Chhattisgarh was the state of the Madhya Pradesh, the state. So it is the relative meaning, Madhya Pradesh and Chhattisgarh. Okay, during the discussion, we can develop more understand about him. So who will be the start? Who will start the discuss for him? And please don't hesitate, start the discuss. May I start questions? Yep. You had said that he was influenced by the Naxalite at the earlier times. So especially the Chhattisgarh is very famous for the Naxalism, especially in India. So nowadays, how is the situation is Naxalite movement? And so after the Sarvajudum, the project, and after that, how is the situation in Chhattisgarh, especially in Bastar? And then I would like to the asking about the POSCO India, the project in Orissa, because it is also related with the environmentalism and neoliberalism. So please comment about that also.
Okay. You see, at the of course, Niyogi was influenced by Naxalism, Maoism in the 60s. It was clear to him, and CPI, ML later on as well became a front. It got divided. Naxalism itself got divided into one segment which went in the parliamentary direction, another segment which kind of moved into the realm of armed struggle, as I was telling you. Shankar Guha Niyogi, at that time, till Shankar Guha Niyogi was there actually, the armed struggle in Chhattisgarh had not really transpired, and people were, perhaps it was his movement, which was in the front line, which was engaged in mass struggle and provided an avenue, different kind of avenue, or perhaps in fact in his last essays, he was mentioning that I don't know how far we can continue with this approach, given the kind of repression we are facing. So that this may be a recipe for and the armed groups to come in and take over, but he himself, which I was trying to point out, himself resisted the temptation, this temptation, even if he was undisputed leader. And his point was that of a political point, that you can't, his understanding of Marxism as he saw it, and the kind of, armed struggle based Marxism, which is another tradition in India, which I pointed out. He did not go in that direction. He was clearly, in fact, that is why some people like to call him the Marxist Gandhian actually, because but it was not because of a moral position on violence, that or non-violence that he was espousing. He ended up in espousing violence, non-violence. But his point was the politicized social transformation, creation through engagement, construction cannot happen. And he in fact asked this question actually right from the 1970s onward, and he kept on asking this question. Now you tell me, why is it that so many world movements who had successfully divide or successfully successful in revolution, political revolution, ended up, and he was clear on it, in failed social experiments, and his point was precisely the point I was talking about. It was because you cannot have politicized social political capture going prior and then presuming that people will accept it, that social transformation and self-transformation will come automatically. This, he was arguing, is not going to happen. So his analysis, his movement was, his path in this context was based on a Marxian question, because he was questioning the path. All the paths in India were available. These were the paths of international Marxist movements at that time. Continues to be so today. And his argument was, well, revolutions have been successful in large part. Why is it that we could not, keep that revolutions? And he basically pointed to Soviet Union and present China as dystopias. He was very clear in his criticism that this, you can't engage in a true, you cannot remain true to Marxism without engaging in political, social, and self-transformation. And you cannot have this in a scenario where the entire objective is violence, and he went into the details of it. He was aware of it. He was, one time influenced by it. He knew about it. He was influenced by Maoism. There's no doubt about it. So he grew up in it. So his point was that violence, you start as a means, but it ends in a politics of class annihilation. It ends in violence, in a culture of violence. And culture of violence cannot produce construction, cannot engage in the creative act, which is what Marxism or Marxian politics demands, which is a transformative project. So I don't know how, what to make of it, but I'm just trying to say what his position was. And it was not a romantic position he was taking, but a position he was saying that that's why resistance is important, because the onus of violence he put on capital and state, that it is they who are engaging violence, and therefore resistance is must. Okay, but resistance without construction, and if you make the logical idea of resistance to political expropriation through the control of state, then that is what we have seen in 20th century Marxism, and that has been a failure. And his point was, this was not a crisis of Marxism, but this was a crisis of understanding the practice of how the practice of Marxism, or how Marxism is to work at the ground level. So that is very important point. And I think while you are right that the CPI Maoists took over became the dominant force from 2000 onwards in Chhattisgarh, in terms of whatever remains of Marxism today, he would be firmly opposed to it, because he remained, and this was his last letter. Actually, that's why I want it to be translated. I mean, we are talking about a very courageous person, unbelievably courageous person, because he knew he would be killed. And he wrote this letter, 3-page letter, and he based some of the basic point he went on arguing that I remain committed to Marxism, Leninism. But I also remain committed to my politics. It's a question of politics. My life is immaterial here. And that, I think, is extraordinary. I mean, I don't know whether you find very few such kind of personality in world Marxism, and I find it extraordinary that he has his life and his work has remained outside the purview. That is what I wanted to say. But in terms of current scenario, I think that's a dead end again. The answer. I have my own, in my own paper, you'll see, I have my own criticism of the way armed struggle has been initiated in respect to Indian Marxism. I think it's been a waste of considerable time. Now, there may have been reasons for it. You can say that definitely there are reasons for it, but so much energy has gone into it, and it has not been very successful. It has remained restricted also, and it has got slowly restricted. And you can't engage in the political space of India without addressing the ideological apparatus, without addressing the space of ideas, and the knowledge and the consciousness of the mass. You can't engage in mass politics. And what Marxism are we talking about if you can't engage with the mass in the end?
Thank you very much.
So,
okay, if you have any, everybody, if you have any question for the Anjan Chakrabarti, please raise your hand so we can give you mic. Professor Chong? Yes, please. Professor Jongsoo Jin. Yeah. Please turn on his mic.
Yeah, actually, I wrote my question in the chat room. So, Anjan, you can
let me just check it.
Yeah, my questions.
Okay.
So, Anjan, thank you very much for great talk. I learned very much from your talk on Shankar Guha Niyogi's Marxism. I have two short questions. I think the second question is a little overlapped with Professor Park's question. So, first question, it looks that Shankar Guha Niyogi's praxis, you mentioned it as a trade union or new model, has much in common with the social movement unionism, which was influential in Brazil and South Africa, in that it pursued the combination of wage and non-wage issues, class and non-class issues, ethnic, ecological issues like that. It is especially remarkable that Shankar Guha Niyogi discovered the social movement unionism independently from and earlier than South Africa, African National Congress, ANC, or Brazilian PT. What do you think about this? And second question, compared with the traditional Indian communist parties, how influential is the Shankar Guha Niyogi's Marxism in India now, today? Was there any significant debate between Niyogi and the traditional Indian communist parties?
Okay, the second part, second question, Anjan, let me begin by pointing out that it's very unfortunate that, and it shows the kind of, it's a reflection of Indian Marxism or communist movement is in crisis in present time. And it is a reflection of the paucity, the emptiness of, or the hollowness, or the absence of debates within Indian communist movement. The last one which happened was in the 60s, but thereafter, which is the context I raised, So it's the kind of ossification that you have, or that we witness in the case of Indian communist movement, the argument has been, with respect to Shankar Guha Niyogi, the charges of reformism, charges of revisionism, charges of being Gandhian, it's more of a dismissive instance rather than a deep-seated engagement. So I think the scenario, because of the crisis that Indian Communist parties find themselves in the present context, my own understanding is some of the issues that he brought up are becoming, that's why I am also, it's a context, you see, in which I discuss, because are also becoming important, because we see here the limitations of the conventional routes that have been followed, as both with respect to parliamentary struggle as well as with respect to parliamentary struggle falling for the trap of statism and economism, as well as armed struggle, which has its own problem. So I think, but in my opinion, that's why I'm saying, how could the world have known about this figure, which takes me to the first question, unless Indian Marxists had engaged with him and brought him into the forefront. And in fact, that is the reason why I'm speaking today. I decided to, that there was such a figure, okay, and his Bengali, his translated his book in Bengali, he wrote in Hindi, Chhattisgarhi, and Bengali, which is native language. It's been translated into Bengali. If anybody is interested, I don't know, in Korean or Japanese or English or whatever, translating it, it will be a service actually, because as you say correctly regarding question one, that he was doing it in the 70s and 1970s and that's why I'm saying he was decades ahead actually of not just Indian Marxism but of world Marxism, in my opinion. Number two point is this, and this is what I will say. He would desist from using terms, in my opinion, such terms as environmentalism or social movement, unionism, and so on and so forth, because he saw this as a project of transformation. Politicized, that's why this is the term that I use, politicized social transformation. So it's just not a movement, it's tangible creation. You create cooperatives, you run it. You create hospitals, you run it. You create schools, 20 schools were created. 10 of them were turned over to government, state, and 10 were run by the workers. You create and you run them. So this he saw was part of the working class identity formation. That identities just don't get formed just like that in thin air. You have to engage in the concrete reality through direct action of the workers themselves, who then will see the problems, engage with it, So this is number one. Number two, he in fact in his last letter, I think last or the interview before the last one, which we have, he was referring to the fact that we don't have even a single communist party today which can address the concrete situation in India today. I am hoping, he was saying, my dream is that such a communist party based on Marxism, Leninism will be created, and that all kinds of such kinds of experiment social movements which are raising the worker consciousness can join together. They will have their differences, but they will learn from one another through these experiments, and through that process learn what is to be resisted and what is to be constructed. So again, when we are discussing, was he just talking about trade union at the end? He created the Chhattisgarh Mukti Morcha, which is a cultural front, a political front. It even won one seat in Chhattisgarh, actually, standing in an election. He was not interested in it, but I don't know why this, one candidate stood and he won, actually. So he was engaging in all kinds of direct political actions as well, and he was firmly committed to that particular to Marxism as well. That is why I'm talking to this in this forum. And indeed, talking, you can refer to Niyogi in terms of social movement unionism. Some have called him Gandhian. He became influenced by Gandhi. He became influenced by Rabindranath Tagore. But he was, in certain aspects, he was also critical of them. So he had a friendly but deep-seated engagement. He made this argument against Indian communists that you don't understand these Indian figures, who had engaged in these projects of reconstruction. So you have to see, you have to learn from them. So he had been called Gandhian, influenced by them. Doesn't make him in my opinion, a Gandhian. And Professor Park has read his essay on environmentalism, I think. And this was written in the 1980s, I think. And he was talking about climate change. And during that time, and how it was related to working class, lifetime working class condition, working class crisis. I'm talking about 1980s, and in direct politics. And he's very clear that the issue of environment will be in the forefront, will be one of the things in the forefront. and it will be developed by the workers themselves through the struggles. And they are engaging, and this was very interesting in this process of construction. So when the public health movement started, there were debate, furious debate happened between preventive and curative medicine among the workers. I mean the workers, I mean the male, female, everybody who were there. Okay. So you're talking about serious engagement with serious issues. They were referring to situations of pollution, that how their own industrial engagement in Bhilai steel plant, in open pit mine, how it was creating problems of pollution and how we would engage with it. You know, how to, look at this situation. So Young, I would be, I understand the temptation to put him here or there, but he was unique because, as you say, I don't find anybody like him actually, and not at least in the Indian context in the 1970s. And this term Sangharsh and Nirman, construction or resistance and construction, or construction and Nirman, has become a catch-call. Even if people do not know Niyogi actually, they use this term actually in their movements, in their engagement. So one of the famous movement in India was Narmada Bachao movement, Narmada Bachao Andolan, and Medha Patkar was a leader of that movement. Medha Patkar was a follower of Shankar Guha Niyogi, of his thoughts. So many leaders who are well known actually all over India, they grew out of this movement, became associated later on.
Thank you. Okay, please raise your hand if you have any question about his presentation. Do you have any question? Please don't hesitate. Yes, please, Professor Park. Please turn on his mic. Mr. Go, please turn on his. Please wait. Okay.
Thanks.
Speaking, please.
Yeah, thanks for giving me a chance to comment on the Professor Anjan's moderate. I'm Park Kyun-yeol. My academic background is political ethics. So I'm not specialized at this area, especially in Marxism or Leninism or communism. Lawfully, I have contact and know about that information. Actually, I'm fundamentally skeptical perspective to Karl Marx and his idea of Marxism, especially in this modern age. As an interpretive theory, we can utilize that the Karl Marx idea. Still, he tried to find an objective when he explained that the situation of his ages, but still his idea, Marxism, is going to be evolved. So where is the terminal objective? Before he's explaining his idea, there had been a lot of structures, ruling party, ruling and exploitation, without any Karl Marx explanation. We have met a lot of cases So my perspective is not of optimism to the Karl Marx. Based on my skeptical idea, I have one question to you, Anjan. We are not have been overcome that turmoils of COVID-19. Is there any effective approach or perspective to explain this coming COVID or pandemic situation, to explain that and prepare for that the COVID-19? That structural function is not ruling or exploitation. So could you explain or predict or give us that the solution to that situation? That's it.
Should I?
Yes, please.
Yeah. There are the skepticism is nothing unusual. We grew up. I have grown up with that skepticism. I am an economist in a mainstream department. I am aware of it. But my understanding is, and I'll come to the associated question in a minute, very quickly. Insofar as Marx's intervention is concerned, and let us only focus on 3 volumes of Capital. I think his the definition of capitalism he presented, and the critique of that he presented, in my opinion, is unique. It cannot be reduced to any other explanation. And it is, let me suggest that if you check the name of the book, it is Capital, and there is a subtitle, Critique of Political Economy. His was a critique of capitalism. He didn't say much about what is to be constructed or not. That was part of the 20th century experiments which happened. But insofar as his critique of capital, he gave certain, pathways and so on and so forth, directions, but he never did any systematic study with respect to that. In fact, he was skeptical about any such blueprints. But his point, so that is why one of the things which interested me in Shankar Guha Niyogi is he would be interested in Shankar Guha Niyogi, because I think Marx is somebody who thought that what will appear in its in place of Marxism, you can't say beforehand. There's no blueprint, but it has to be constructed as we go along. So anyway, insofar as the critique of capitalism is concerned, which you rightly point out, is a critique of basically arguing that capitalism was, and its political counterpart, equality, liberty, fraternity, initiated in the French Revolution, and Marx was a child of that revolution. But his basic point was to say that this notion of equality or liberty you have is an illusion, is a delusion under capitalism. It will inherently based on inequality, and that inequality is based on the organization of exploitation. That is the employers and employees, which is unique to capitalism, which had not existed before it. So insofar as this connection of inequality as a problem, as a socio-economic problem, and its relation to exploitation as the definitional content of capitalism, I think he, in my opinion, provided a unique and a very profound critique of it, in my opinion. And that is why, despite this skepticism, despite attempts to erase him, somehow he doesn't die, actually. And you wonder how could such a figure survive. And my understanding is, as long as systems of exploitation such as capitalism will live, his theory, and which in turn generate the scenario of inequality in income wise, wealth wise, social inequality, Marx will be a living presence. And so, as I see it, the relevance of Marxism or Marx has not receded, but rather, if you take the current context and the see the situation, in my opinion, his relevance has only increased. That is what I understand. No, but I am one with you regarding this, Professor Park. I'm right, Professor Park? Yeah, I'm one with you on this, that Marx alone, this is it, but Marx alone will not do, and that is why, for me, Shankar Guha Niyogi is important, because it tells you he was engaging with Gandhism, with Niyogi, he was engaging with technology and with all these aspects, keeping his Marxism intact, because and the concrete reality of the situation in which Chhattisgarh is. He did a detailed ethnographic mapping in those 6 years he roamed about in Chhattisgarh of what this soil and the people are. Actually, you have to understand it if you want to engage in real-time politics. Okay, the concrete reality. So he was engaging in environmental issue, all those things, So on that, I say, but in my opinion, insofar as Marx, or what the insight Marx provided, and the kind of critique that has been developed since following the insight of Marx, in my opinion, remains not only true even today, but perhaps more important to look at in the present context of so much income, social wealth, and social inequality that we are having, And so this is number one point I'd like to say. Number 2 point, if one aspect of Marx's Capital, as I see, was regarding exploitation, another aspect of Marx's Capital, which was a critique of capitalism in his presentation, was that this system, capitalism, is inherently unstable. That you cannot have a stable, harmonious, orderly capitalism. That it has tendencies and contradictory tendencies, where you will have these situations of booms and then you'll have busts. You will have primitive accumulation, continuous attack on existing forms, and their displacement, dislocation. This is a continual issue with the way this MCM dash, or the circuits of capital, function. So the instability of capitalism, its collapse leading to crisis in individual social life, is a constant recurring process. And indeed, a simple thing like an economic data will show you that every 7 years, there is a downturn in capitalism. Every 7 years. So in other words, this system is inherently unstable. It is not just unjust, but it is unstable. And this instability, and this takes you to your question, last question. This may happen due to any number of reasons. So the 1920s, 30s crash, it happened for some other different reasons. But soon that MCM dash, that capitalist relations of production, ran into a crisis. It collapsed. In the 2008, you might have had this Korean crisis. I think Seonjung wrote about it. In the 1990s, it might have happened due to some other reason. I don't know, currency crisis or something like that, perhaps, may have been the cause. But it soon had, through this contradictory effects on other things, it had a smashing effect on the MCM dash, creating the instability. Then 2008 crash, the home loan crisis and so on, somewhere in distant America, United States, soon engulfing the entire world, leading to the collapse of the system. Then This time it is the pandemic. But what has been it said? The system is unable. This was also Marx's point. This MCM dash, I don't have the shared screen any longer, but remember that capitalist relations of production, the MCM, that circuit, it is conditioned by various elements. Natural condition, which includes the viruses as well, the environmental condition, the climatic condition, all those things. It includes cultural condition. Okay. It includes, the floating of ideas, what is right, what is wrong. All these are important issues, which is helping sustain it. Political process, the political institutions that you have, as well as the forms of political ideas that you have. Again, another conditions of existence. Then you have other economic conditions of existence, like whether, for example, you will have now the old global order, where there is free movement of goods and services, or with the current geopolitical change, you will have a more nationalized economy. It's a very important conditions of existence that will determine what goods and services are going to produce, how much is going to be sold. Hence, it's going to affect the organization of exploitation. So Marx never meant by capitalism just MCM dash. He was talking about ism is a system. He was talking about this relations being maintained by the various conditions, and it is reproducing itself as a system. And the crisis may happen due to change in any one of them, actually, which could have a devastating impact on other processes and bring the system down, as it has. And the point I'm making, Professor Park, is why Marx is more relevant today, because he's the only one who has predicted this, who has predicted the recurring collapse of capitalism. And it has happened 3 times, major collapse, perhaps in Korea, 1990s, you can think. So our skepticism regarding existing 20th century socialism may be right. We might have to think about it, that indeed, whether it can sustain itself or not. But we must not suffer from any illusion that capitalism also has collapsed. In the last 100 years, it has collapsed 4 times, 3 to 4 times, absolutely collapsed, leaving millions, if not billions, in their social life in a scenario of crisis, individual and social life in a scenario of crisis. And when you look at the history of capitalism, right from the 12th, 15th, 16th century to the present time, how many times have capitalism failed? Do we discuss it? Why is it that this system continues to recurrently fail, collapse? And what is the ethical, if I may bring in ethic, and by the way, ethic and morality was a very important, ethic versus morality was a very important debate in this Shankar Guha Niyogi movement. And I didn't go into that, but it was a very important debate which happened actually. So, these are, so in other words, I don't mind discussing, and I have here discussed the problems of Marxism, problems of socialism through Shankar Guha Niyogi. But, in the same vein, we have to discuss the problems of existing ideas as well as the system of capitalism as well. So you can't just wish that out. That is my only point I'd like to say. Yes, thank you.
Okay, Professor Park,
Yes.
do you have any? Yes, please.
Yes, I have additional question. I raised the effectiveness of Karl Marx's perspective, but actually I got some point about what I raised. But anyhow, still I have additional question. On of the effectiveness of interpretation and anticipation, still you want to recast that what Karl Marx did explain, to especially focusing on that collapse or some severe problem inside the capitalism of capital countries. Actually, I want to raise some problem, especially focusing on this, meeting COVID pandemic situation. Yeah, all countries, even that the ideological, non-ideologically, the communist country or capital country, all countries participated in develop and provide and divine that technology, especially focusing on the vaccine or treatment. Okay, why I asked that question, even as you explained that the effectiveness of Karl Marx, well, it could be possible, but actually isn't there any other perspective of a theory? For example, John Rawls, one of the justice principle, especially second principle, maximum idea. Yet, if we use that John Rawls idea more effectively, we can explain that situation, especially in dividing in terms of redistributive justice. Is there any, if still the Karl Marx survival revive in this era, how can we solve that problem, especially that in dividing that the vaccine of the COVID-19? That's my question.
Okay. Professor Park, I have 5 minutes to reply.
Yes.
Yes. Very quickly. In fact, this was precisely what I was trying to suggest was Marx's contribution, just beginning with the last point, in my opinion, as I understand. First of all, I think you are suggesting it, and you are right in it, that there's no one interpretation or reading of Marx. Marx is a contested claim, in terms of, even when we are talking about capital, there are different kinds of interpretations that happen, and accordingly, you can have different positions. So let's be clear on this. So this is true for all thinkers, and in the field of economics, the same is true for Adam Smith, same is true for Amartya Sen, same is true for all these different kinds of figures, Keynes. These are contested figures. So and because contested, because they have so much to offer. They can offer different things to different. But in my opinion, one thing that Marx would be very different from Rawls, Sen, Dworkin, all those other, even G.A. Cohen, all those other, Cohen would be more understandable, but all those other thinkers, Marx would be different from, is that he would be one with them regarding the importance of distributive justice or redistributive justice, that it is important to do so. But his main point was that the question of distribution cannot be delinked from the question of production, organization of production. That the reason why you have a problem at the domain of distribution, which from my end I would call it problem at the domain of symptom, okay, is that this income and social inequality that you are seeing, you are not dealing with the source of it, the disease. So your attempt to treat the symptoms, say through various distributive mechanism, and these have been tried for 100 years, believe me, and continue to be tried for 100 years. And despite all of that, why is it that we are not just having faced with that problem, but that problem continues to grow, that of income inequality, wealth inequality, social inequality? All these kinds of distributive mechanisms, and I'm aware of some of the debates you're talking about. I'm aware of Rawls. I teach it in my classes as well. They are not addressing, per se, the question of the fact which Marx was addressing, Okay, not that it makes them wrong, but what I'm saying is Marx is unique because he connected that problem with the organization of production. That the division that you find in the social plane is a division that has to be seen as connected in the site of production itself. And this is the class division between those who are performing the surplus and those who are appropriating the surplus, in charge of appropriating the surplus. Change that, then we can have a debate. But that is the very system, essence of the system of capitalism. Capitalism is inherently defined in terms of not this or that distribution, defined in terms of employer-employee relation, in terms of the organization of production, in terms of the fact that there is a division between the class of performers and division between the class of appropriators. There's this division. There's another kind of division, Marx. This is all introduced, which is appearing in the domain of production, which political economy and their new variants are missed out. And that you cannot, production, distribution, consumption, they have to be treated as intertwined. So Marx will engage with, and in my own work I do, with Amartya Sen, Rawls, all these figures, they are important with the question of distribution and so on, with the question of ethics, morality, all those things would be important. But he would bring this additional aspect of class exploitation or the organization of production. What to produce, who to produce, where it will be produced, who decides that? You have a small bunch of people who are deciding that. Okay. And who gets to appropriate the surplus, expropriate the surplus? A small, tiny segment of the population gets to do that. So Marx would connect all these issues with it, and he would say that don't detach the symptom from the disease. These treat them as connected. Let's talk about ethics. Let's talk about morality in the system of capitalism. Capitalism as a system, not this or that individual, not this or that part, but as a system. So this is a very important point in the sense that this is Keynes' idea, in Keynes' political theory, of governing the effects, governing the effects is the typical way you are dealing with the issue, and you have been dealing with the issue for the last 100 years, effects of capitalism. Its effects of exploitation, precarity, working class condition, and the instability, consequences of instability. So you're governing the effects. That is what is basically you are doing. You are not dealing with the cause of the effects. You are not connecting it with the symptoms, treating it in a holistic manner. And the question of vaccine, I have just small point to make. Who doesn't know that that pandemic has been there before human civilization? Pandemic has been there when human civilization is here. Pandemic will be there after human civilization is gone. I mean, virus. I'm not talking about pandemic. I'm talking about virus. It's nothing unusual. This is given information. Everybody knows it. What kind of, I ask you, with so much wealth, what kind of system is this, where even 100 years ago, you had a major pandemic, and small pandemics have continued to occur since the 1980s, Ebola and, all those kinds of other kinds of, pandemic-like situation in small segment. It's a known information. What kind of ethical system is this system, which has in turn actually, instead of ensure that we deal with this scenario, to deal with food crisis, we store food. And the food is stored so that we don't get a food crisis when there is a crop failure or anything like that. Why hasn't hospitals, nurses, etc., and vaccine programs been initiated? Such kinds of scenarios not been initiated. If those kinds of investments, yes, the pandemic will happen 20 years, 30 years, 40 years down the line. So will a food crisis. You deal with the food crisis in one way. Why can't you anticipate the pandemic? Instead of dealing with public health, what you have done is, all over the world, I'm not talking about Korea because I don't know what the scenario is in Korea. You privatize the healthcare for profit. Who on earth, where a capitalist is going to invest, for storing ventilators, for research and R&D development, for creating hospital beds and so on, and engaging in maintaining them? Which capitalist is going to engage in that, dependent on when the pandemic will happen? Under a scenario for profit, if you are engaging in for profit, you are engaging in short term, you are trying to generate as much as possible from the investment in the present system. It's a systemic failure that we were unprepared for, the systemic failure that the system was unprepared for the pandemic. So I turn the question around to ask yourself, why amid so much riches, amid so much expenditure on healthcare, why is it that we were not prepared for a pandemic? At least we didn't have the logistical setup to face a pandemic when it is a known information that pandemics will hit us. That's an information given by world history. So I will turn the question around and will put the onus on what kind of system is this that cannot sustain itself. And I'm not talking about USA or China, because my rendition is that the mode of, or the relations of production is predominantly capitalist, even in China. So when I'm talking about capitalism, I'm talking really in terms of global capitalism. So what kind of so I'll put the question back to you. And even now, when you are engaging with vaccines, there's a competition going on. Who is going to profit from it? Who is going to get it? Who is not going to get it? I mean, Professor Park, this is an ethical and moral question, which has been raised even by the world, world organizations. So, how do you, there's no other system. We are talking about capitalism. So what kind of system is this that we are even having to discuss this? It's a shame that we are even having to discuss this, regarding who is going to get vaccine first, who is not going to get vaccine, whether the poor are going to get the vaccine or not, and so on and so forth. So
Thank you.
That would be my response. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your intuitive answer. And I think, and is there any question? If you raise your hand, I will give you a last chance for. Okay. Professor Jung, do you have any comment? No, yes. So around 2 hours had passed. So we are very enjoyed your nice presentation and the discussions. So I think it is very happy and intuitive times to share with the ideas of the trade unionism in India, and further the situation of the COVID like this. So we can conclude the global Marxism online talk. So thank you very much, Professor Anjan Chakrabarti and Professor Sungjin Jung, convener of the Institute of Social Science, and Mr. Ko Jin Woo to help the talking. And thank you very much, all participants. Thank you. Okay, we can conclude this. Thank you.
Thank you, First Friend, and yes. Thank you, Anjan Chakrabarti. See you next time.
For having me.
Yes.
Bye bye, master. 박준호 교수님 감사합니다. 이제
네.
또 끄도록 하겠습니다.
네.